Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I'd like to welcome you to the 17th Annual Oscar Howe Memorial Lecture. My name is Royce Engstrom. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the University. And it's just a great pleasure to have you all here tonight to share in this lecture. It's a real privilege for me to be able to make this introduction. This has been a very, very busy week here at the University, a very exciting week and a fun week for a variety of reasons. But I feel like I've been going from buffet to buffet all week long this week, very well fed. It's been a great week for the arts here. Last night we had an opening of a photographic exhibit of Paul Schiller, who is just a remarkable photographer and an alum of this university. And so we had that very nice event last night over at the Foundation building. And that was followed by just a marvelous performance here in this room by the Rollins Trio. And some of you, I know, were there last night for that. So it's been just a very exciting week. We have some very special guests on campus today and tomorrow that I'd like to introduce before we get to the topic of this evening's event. That is, we have several people who are here to be recognized through an alumni leadership program that we have. These are folks who have graduated from the university at some point in the past and have gone on to a career of some sort, and they all have been very creative, dynamic individuals. And so each year the colleges and schools are asked to nominate an individual to be recognized during this alumni leadership event. And so a number of those folks are here, and I'd like to call them out and ask them to stand, and then we'll recognize them as a group at the end. I'm not sure that they all made it over to the event here from the reception, but I know some of them have. So John Dill, did you make it over? Okay, John. John is in Kansas City. He works for Hallmark. Tom Morgan, I know, is here. Tom. Tom is an entrepreneur from California who is actually in the process of starting a business here in Sioux Falls and moving back to South Dakota, a biology graduate. Rebecca Craddock. Rebecca is lives in Sioux Falls, has been in the state legislature, and is the Vice President for Clinical and Professional Services. Laura Keppen. Laura is a physician, graduated in '79 with her MD degree, and is a pediatric endocrinologist in Sioux Falls as well. Fred Selenica is from the Vera McKinnon system. I don't believe Fred was able to make it down today. He'll be with us tomorrow. Pam Holman is the superintendent of the Sioux Falls School District, and I had the opportunity to see her in action last week at the Sioux Falls School Board meeting. Diane Krupa, I don't believe made it here this evening either. She is a judge in the United States Tax Court, graduate of the law school. And Gary Bergman is Gary here, School of Education grad. Okay, so let's give these folks a round of applause. If you are able, tomorrow afternoon, these folks are going to be serving a panel discussion with some of our faculty on the topic of really the future of higher education and how we should be training our students these days. This is the Oscar Howe Memorial Lecture, and of course named after a phenomenal artist that was on the faculty here at the University of South Dakota. And we are delighted to have with us this evening some members of the Howe family, and I'd like to introduce them if I could at this point. We have Heidi, who is the wife of Oscar Howe. The daughter of Oscar Howe is here, Inga Dawn Marish, and her husband, Dr. Jim Marish. It's a real honor that you could join us this evening. Thank you for coming. They're here every year. The Oscar Howe Lecture is a key event of the College of Fine Arts, of course, and has become one of the university's signature events of the year as well. This lecture was inaugurated in 1990 to honor Oscar, of course, and the lecture has become an important component in this university's interest in Native American issues and education. The lecture is one of the events that we have every year that complements our academic programming here at the university along the lines of Native American studies. And so I'd like to just talk to you briefly about the university's increasing commitment to American Indian studies and diversity in a general sense. We've had the Institute for American Indian Studies on this campus really since 1955, and Oscar Howe was hired just a couple of years after that and served many years on the faculty here. We recently have moved the Institute to academic department status, and so now we have an academic department of American Indian Studies under the direction of Mark Daniels, the chair. Is Mark here this evening? I'm not sure that he's here. We are building the faculty in American Indian Studies and trying to increase our emphasis in that area and have more students take courses in that area. In addition, another move that we've made just recently is to put in place an Office of Diversity and to hire for the first time in the university's history a Chief Diversity Officer, Bruce King. And so that has been another important move for us. We recognize our responsibility to address the education of and about the American Indians, and we're very proud to be able to do that. So tonight, it is a great privilege for me to introduce the person who's going to speak, and it's the person who himself has made this introduction many times over the years, and in fact is the person who inaugurated this lecture series, John Day. John has been a member of the university community for 32 years, and I would say a tremendous driving force behind what this institution has done, and it's been just a pleasure to work with because of his creativity and energy. He came to the university as a part-time instructor, quickly moved into the position of chair of the Department of Art, and in short time became Dean of the College of Fine Arts, a position that he served for 22 years. He also served a stint as acting Vice President for Academic Affairs for a year in the mid-'80s. John is currently Professor Emeritus of Art and is serving as the Director of the university's art galleries now. A very important responsibility, and one that we're happy to be able to emphasize more and more. So John has been a scholar of Oscar Howe throughout his career, and I know that in recent years, since he stepped down from the deanship, he's had more time to focus his energy on the study of Oscar Howe. So I am really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Before I turn the podium over to John, let me just remind you that after the lecture, we'll take some time for questions, and then we'd like to move over to the Native American Center across the street for a reception. We hope that you'll be able to join us there. With that, please join me in welcoming John Day.
Thank you very much. Well, they've got me wired 3 different ways here, so we'll see which one works. I remember when I first began speaking to audiences about Oscar Howe, it was a lot simpler. I took in a couple of reproductions and sat down. Now I've got 2 speakers, a computer, a projector, and hearing aids. I'll put the hearing aids in if necessary when we have the reception. Well, I'd like to welcome you. Forgive my voice. I have allergies, and they seem to always settle in my vocal cords about this time of year. I would reiterate that we do have a wonderful reception afterwards in the Native American Center, and please do join us. The drum will be doing honoring songs for the Howe family. The purpose of the Oscar Howe Memorial Lecture is to promote awareness and appreciation for the best of Native American contemporary art as a vital part of American culture. In line with that, the technology is failing us. Come on, it was working before. Corey? What? Come. That's all I wanted to do, and that's what I was doing. There's an awful rumor out there that I'm technology impaired. That's just a silly thing. All right, I would also call your attention to the fact that we have always paired this event with a major Indian market that is held annually in Sioux Falls. It is the Northern Plains Indian Market, and it is happening Saturday and Sunday at the Dakota exhibit hall in Sioux Falls, and it is a wonderful, not-to-be-missed event. And so I would give you that little advertisement. Having said that, I want to speak a little bit about Oscar Howe and his relationship to the University of South Dakota. Oscar spent 23 years on our faculty here and made a tremendous difference. But beyond that 23 years, he has a 50-year heritage because of all the things that he inspired while he was here. He had many people who helped him along the way. Certainly from Arts and Sciences, Dean Elbert Harrington, who was responsible for bringing him onto the faculty, along with W.O. Farber of great fame, and of course our own Wayne Knutson. All of those people saw in Oscar Howe, as many others did, a great artist, a great man, and somebody they wanted to have associated with the University of South Dakota. His impact on us was tremendous. And that impact is seen in the fact that the university today has the Oscar Howe collection, which is the largest single collection of Oscar Howe's work in the world. We have over 50 Oscar Howe paintings and many drawings and other objects that Oscar has created. We operate the Oscar Howe Gallery, which is just at the end of this hall. It is open 6 days a week from 1 to 5 and offers you an opportunity to see on a rotating basis some of the things from our collection. We have the Oscar Howe Research Archives in the ID Weeks Library, which brings scholars regularly to the University of South Dakota to take advantage of those resources. We have the Oscar Howe Memorial Association, which sponsors this lecture. And we have one of the things that is nearest and dearest to my heart, the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute, which Oscar began himself in the early 60s, and we'll talk about a bit later, but for 10 years, he made a tremendous difference. He had a vision about what a difference he could make and the university could make in the lives of young, aspiring Native American artists, and for 10 years, he made a tremendous difference. We were fortunate enough to be able to reintroduce that, and this last year, we completed our 16th annual Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute. We've served well over 200 students in that time, many of whom have gone on to earn MFAs and BFAs. Now, I'm often asked, this is something that makes me feel increasingly older. I'm always asked, after I give the presentation speech, did you know Oscar Howe? And somehow I'm figuring they could feel they could ask the same question about, did you know Michelangelo? You know? So there's this awe in their voice. So for ethical proof, I want to go through very quickly. The ethical proof shows you that I'm on one side, Wayne Knutson's on the other, and Oscar Howe is in the middle. I first met Oscar Howe in 1972 when he was doing a presentation at Mount Morley College, and I was very impressed with his presentation of the art that he showed. Afterwards, engaged him in conversation and found that I was terribly impressed with the man. The dignity, the reserve, the strength that I sensed in him, he was truly exceptional. Then I came a few years later as an adjunct faculty member to the university and had a chance to visit with him since he was on the faculty. Then I became chair, which was a humbling experience, to be responsible for the people of the quality of Oscar Howe. So we worked in that level. About that same time, Dr. Knutson, and I would thank him forever for this, basically made me the curator of the Oscar Howe collection. And every year then I got to pick Oscar Howe paintings to add to our collection. And I became director of the University Art Galleries. And that all led into just a lifetime of experience with the Oscar Howe legacy, including organizing many exhibitions, most importantly, the major retrospective exhibition of Oscar Howe collected 100 works from all over the world and toured this to 12 different sites throughout the country. And since Oscar Howe's death, I have been privileged to work closely with Mrs. Howe. Heidi, I consider to be a tremendous friend. And so we have grown in that relationship too. Oscar Howe has two Native American names, and perhaps the third. I'll talk about the meaning of those a bit later. Oscar Howe is known as Mazuha Hoshina, and then later, and that's a name he received from his maternal grandfather, Not Afraid of Bear, to honor his father, White Bear, who received a medal for protecting white pioneers, white settlers, during the Santee Uprising of 1862. That name, Masuha Hoshina, has been translated two ways. One is son of honored by medal, and Oscar would frequently or occasionally say that's what it means. But it has been commonly translated as trader boy. And Oscar would occasionally accept that interpretation as well. I've always liked trader boy because I feel that at the heart of Oscar Howe, that is what he did. He traded between two cultures, the best of both. And so I won't give up on trader boy and accept that as an alternate definition of his name. The second name I find really charming. I had never heard it. Nobody's nowhere in our literature, in our extensive archives. Lo and behold, in one of my trips down to the Joslin, I found a little article in a relatively small packet of information on Oscar Howe, where in the World Herald Tribune they said his Indian name was Itankan. And so I came back and asked, what does Itankan mean? And I was told it means master. And that made great sense to me. Here was obviously a master. And then, in a little aside, characteristic of Jerome Kilsmall, he said it can also mean boss. I often thought of Oscar as being very authoritative, and I suspect he was bossy in his own way. This is Oscar Howe. I love this photograph. It was taken by the photographer for the Minneapolis Tribune back in the 60s sometime, and of a series that when they ran an article on Oscar in their Sunday supplement. This shows the man, I believe, in his power, his strength, his dignity, his resolve. He was a person of great charisma, although he was very quiet and very reserved most of the time. I'm going to read you a quote that has always meant a great deal to me about Oscar. It is not easy to be an Indian in modern times. If he, the Indian, is lucky, he might have the best of both cultures. If he is not that fortunate, he may be caught between two worlds and feel that he belongs to neither. And I have seen in so many of my experiences with artist friends like Bobby Penn, that struggle that Oscar seemed to handle so readily. Others of equal talent, maybe, in Bobby's case, were not able to manage. Oscar was a Yanktonia Sioux, Dakota speaker, and he came from a very distinguished family. The family included orators, treaty signatories, people who received medals, like White Bear and Bone Necklace, his great-grandfathers. His paternal grandfather, Onspeshny, who is pictured here, was the last of the hereditary chiefs of the Yanktonia Sioux. So he came from a tremendous lineage. I particularly like to show this image of Unspecially because it tells us something very insightful into what happened to Native peoples as they were brought to the reservation. They were given white names, interpreted by people who were more or less fluent in both languages, but not totally. And so many times names were mistranslated, and they continue today. Oscar's maternal side was Fearless Bear, and that got translated sometimes as Not Afraid of Bear. Unspecially meant something that is really not translatable. And so they decided it would be don't know how. It means something like, doesn't get it right, but don't know how. The father later dropped the don't know and added E. His maternal grandmother, Shellface, was very important to his life. She was a native speaker all her life, never spoke English. And since Oscar's mother, Ella Fearless Bear, who is shown here, died when Oscar was 7. His contact with the maternal side of the family was through Shellface, who was a great talker, who was a great artist in her own right, who was a person who told him the stories. Now, any of you who are historians understand that you have to contextualize a person's life story, that it has a background. Oscar Howe's life, I often think, was one of those stories that's unique to people who are at the right place, at the right time, and are the right person. Many of us live through amazing times without being amazing people. Probably the most of us. Okay? Speaking as somebody who was a hippie in the 60s and ended up being a dean. I mean, how much wronger can you go? So anyhow, Oscar, of course, was one of those great people. So you need to understand how close he was to that tradition that he was making bridges between it and the mainstream. It was just 25 years between his birth in 1915 and Wounded Knee. The extinction of the buffalo, or virtual extinction of the buffalo, and 30 million of them were wiped out. He lived in a community where there was very little English spoken. It was way back in the boonies at Joe Creek and Crow Creek Indian Reservation. No longer exists because it basically was wiped out. Sloan Pick Dam series, and basically Lake Oahe swallowed it up. Howe said it was a post office. It was really in the middle of nowhere. So his association with Native people were very, very traditional and very tied to this life that was pre-reservation. Certainly on Joe, in pictures of him at Joe Creek on the Crow Creek Indian Reservation, you see that his experience was the experience of most of the rural Indians of that time. There was poverty. There was also illness, no great health care, poor education, and cultural crisis going on all around. Economic crisis, cultural crisis, and health crisis. So at the tender age of 7, following government policy, which at that point in time was to assimilate Native American people into the mainstream culture. We do a lot of time in American talking about the melting pot, but we really want a melting pot which basically is homogeneous, like I always think of Campbell's tomato soup. And so they basically were going to assimilate Native Americans, and this had been the policy for a long time. So one of the best ways to assimilate Native Americans was to bring them in, send them to government-run boarding schools or religious-run boarding schools run on a military basis. Deny them their culture, deny them contact with their people, deny them their language. And so this led to a great deal of mistreatment, which you can read about in many people's life experiences. For Howe, it was traumatic. Much corporal punishment, beaten because he didn't speak, because he couldn't speak English. He was not allowed to speak his Dakota. And to make things worse, these were festering holes of unhealth, because you're blocking all these people together into situations where there are highly contagious diseases that pass easily. And so many people came down with serious diseases. Howe himself caught the common malady of trachoma and was diagnosed as somebody who could not be helped, and basically told he was going to go blind. To make things worse, he had a tremendous skin disease, which had also occurred earlier in his life on the reservation, and then came up again when he was at the Pier Indian School. Scarred him so badly that nobody would talk to him. Even his cousin, his brothers, would not have anything to do. He was ostracized further by his peers because of this. It was probably best judgment. It was a severe case of impetigo. If anybody remembers in the historic past, impetigo is a pretty ugly skin disease. So in 1925, Oscar Howe was sent home. Now his mother had died the year before, so it was his grandmother who took him in. And he showed what Oscar Howe was made of in the way that he approached this illness. He decided he was not going to give up. He was going to persevere, and he was going to be the one who justified a name that was given to him informally when he was a 5-year-old, which meant the intelligent, capable one, understanding one. I will be that, and I will show them. So every day, every hour of every day, he would wash himself with commercial soap, lye soap, let it dry, wash it off, day after day after day after day, regardless of weather, and he eventually was cured. And his eyesight came back, and he returned to the Pier Indian School in 1926 and stayed there until 1933. Now we'll talk a little bit about the changes, because he went back to a different Pier Indian School. Now there was no art at the Pier Indian School, okay, but there were opportunities for people who liked to draw, and Howe took advantage of it for drawing in contests and competitions, which he almost always won. And here in the school publication, Good News, he did cover after cover after cover using stencils. And you can see that even here, he had a talent for a young man of 10, 11, and no art instruction whatsoever. Now, let's look at the historic context that he, in his second phase of his schooling, and from subsequently thereon went. Land allotment kind of was the last straw in the assimilation effort. After that, starting in the 1920s, there was a new and enlightened vision because assimilation simply wasn't working. And that is, first of all, and this is a startling fact for many people, that Indian people weren't citizens until 1924. And so there was a change in the way we saw the incorporation of Native American people into the melting pot, if you will. The Merriam report was just absolutely harsh, critical, and scathing about what had gone before, and proposed that what we needed to do was accept the Indians as Indians, give them back their culture and their dignity, and count them in as part of the American melting pot. Well, that was certainly aided and abetted by by FDR's election in 1933, and then by the Indian New Deal, and then the establishment of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. You see what's happened here is that new enlightened view of what role Indians played in American life, coupled with the economic policies of the Great Depression, of the New Deal, to make a policy of equipping Native Americans to make a living through their art. Now, Howe graduated from the Pier Indian School in 1933. What do? Middle of the Dust Bowl, middle of the Depression. He went back to Crow Creek. The only opportunity there for him at Crow Creek was to join the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division. And for almost a year, a little more than a year, he worked on a road crew. The CCC Indian Division hired half of the Native American male household heads in all of the South Dakota reservations. It was a major employer during the Depression. And those people built roads on the reservation. Tough, hard, dangerous work. Howe developed tuberculosis and would no longer do that and was sent to a very special place that was just getting started, and that is the Santa Fe Indian School. At that point in time, and I'll talk about that a bit later, the revolution about giving our Indian artists, our Indians, their culture back, found a place and a person that was kind of the fulcrum, the cutting edge. And between 1935 and 1938, Oscar was with an amazing group of artists who represented the next generation of Native American artists. The people who made the transition to professional artists came through this program under the guidance of Dorothy Dunn. So his classmates read like a who's who of the next generation of Native artists. And so we need to look at what is happening in Indian art. And so what is happening in Indian art is that there is a kind of transition now towards art that is an accommodation between the native tradition, drawn from hide painting, etc., and artwork on paper that is going to be purchased in the marketplace, okay, by museums, by collectors, by people, etc. Art exhibits start springing up everywhere. I always like to point out that in this critical period, the College of Fine Arts, the University of South Dakota, was funded. So there was a spirit in those times about the arts, the importance and the role of the arts. That's why the WPA played such a tremendous role in the Works Progress Administration in producing millions of pieces of art in America. Okay? So in 1932, Santa Fe Indian School was founded by this remarkable person. And what she was heir to was a style developed in the 1918, 1922, in Oklahoma, called the Kiowa Five, a group of Indian people who were taken out of reservation settings and sent to the University of Oklahoma because they were talented, and there in a special program they created art, and they developed the first phase of Native American fine arts. It was like this one by Spencer Asa, which is basically flat shapes, soft colors, no depth, no background, traditional subjects, watercolor on paper. That's important because the development from that point forward keys on this. Oscar Howe's revolution keys on it, and Oscar Howe's traditionalism keys on this. This is an Oscar Howe painting from 1936, okay? First or second year at Santa Fe. Remember, he went there in 35. I like to think this is second semester work, okay, of a high school sophomore. Okay, you see that it's pretty well following that Kiowa 5 style. Watercolor on paper, no background. Keep this in mind as you see Oscar Howe develop as an artist. Other artists that were with him there that went on to international reputation and acclaim as he did include Alan Hauser, who has a major foundation now and is a major force in Indian art. At least his heritage is. Pablito Velarde, the same. But there were literally dozens of them. And these people's art toured New York, Chicago, San Francisco, London, Paris, Munich. They traveled around the world. And they sold. One of my favorite stories, because I think it has something special for every artist, is Oscar sold his first work at the Santa Fe Indian School for 50 cents. Okay, now that was pretty good money, not bad money, you know, 50 cents. The lesson he learned from that was the school took 25 cents. Okay, Corey, you should make sure you get 50% of every sale that goes through the art department. Okay, he graduated there, very distinguished. Now, one of the things that my lengthy association with Oscar Howe's legacy has done is I have talked to people who knew Howe intimately at many points in his life. Bessie Cornelius, for example, was a classmate of his at Santa Fe. She described him to me. My reaction to him, my initial reaction, as being very disciplined, very dignified, very to himself, very industrious, were echoed by her. That's what that whole class thought about him. And he was salutatorian of the class. In 1938, he returned, and remember that date because I'm going to show you a piece of art at the end of this whatever it is, PowerPoint, that he made in his final year that just has come back to South Dakota as part of our collection, has a delightful story with it. So, he came back to South Dakota, and he became instructor at the Pier Indian School, that very school that he had such difficulty with in the early attendance. He came back, and he was an instructor there of art. For room and board. Okay? So that was not a really great deal. So, in 1940, he was assigned to the South Dakota Works Progress Administration Artist Project. Now, Howe intersected with three major events, and he took benefit of what each one of these had to offer him and to have to offer his culture. The WPA, which hired millions of people to work, and thousands of artists, and produced art, really was a great educational force in American art. It made American art popular art. Okay? Howe was part of that. He was in World War II, as you'll see later on. Not that that in itself was a great learning experience, but it had its moments, I'm sure. But out of that, he came back and he took full advantage of the GI Bill, which educated over 2.5 million vets. They were expecting maybe 700,000 vets will take advantage of it. 2.5 million, and in the process, revolutionized American higher education. Howe took full advantage of that, and that's a wonderful part of his life. So as a WPA artist, he illustrated books, wonderful books. Little Lost Sioux, Legends of the Mighty Sioux. He also took mural painting course at, from Ole Nordmark, for those of you who are Swedish fans, or derivation, at the Indian Crafts Center in Lawton, Oklahoma. A several month enterprise there, along with other major artists, largely from Oklahoma. This is a work that he did that was, to my knowledge, put in at Fort Thompson, and then it was also lost to the flood. But probably the two murals that we know the most, although there is one quite remarkable one in Illinois at Proviso High, the two we know best are in Mitchell at the old Carnegie Library. Incidentally, WPA in South Dakota, the Works Progress Administration was based in Mitchell. So Howe was living in Mitchell from 40 to 42 when he was drafted. Loved that community. Okay? So here is Rain and Sun Clouds Over the Hills, painted in a dome with a skylight in the top in August in South Dakota. No air conditioning. Had to work at night. Started as he was trained to in egg tempera, went home to sleep, came back, it had all blistered off. You know, it had just baked. So, tore it off, repainted it in oils, and it is a beautiful, wonderful abstract painting, and you still have access to see it. The one that is truly most remarkable, however, not necessarily for his art, because he was dictated to stylistically and subject matter-wise, as many WPA artists were by local sponsors, are 10 major murals, each 16 by 20 feet, in the gymnasium at Mobridge. Okay. Painted directly on pasture. How many people were denied, basically were invited to do this, and they all turned it down. Howe was invited to do it. He said, sure. He had never seen this. He didn't know. He walked in, and I think his mouth must have dropped. But he painted the first 5 in 2 weeks with help from several people, and then he was drafted. Reported to Fort Snelling, be inducted. The Mobridge people are saying, whoa, wait a minute. We've got half of the gymnasium decorated here. And they started writing, and so they got him a 2-week furlough to paint these other 5. With the assistance of one person. Howe came in there, and these second 5 are truly remarkable. They're so much better than the first 5, I have to believe he let a lot of people help him on the first 4, or the first 5, on the north side. These are truly remarkable. They are the sequence that tell about the rituals of the Sioux. And even though they're representational and not Howe's Indian style, they're quite remarkably done. He painted those 5 days. So you really need, this was a man who was determined. He had sandwiches brought in, he slept an hour on the floor, he painted. And this is the kind of man he is. Now this is what his style was like. Okay, pretty vintage Santa Fe, or what we call the studio. Later, and unkinder people call it Bambi, okay? Because it does have a certain kind of Walt Disney-ish style about it. Howe was a master of it, and as you can see, adding some background and some depth, etc. When he was drafted, he serves in the artillery. He was with an anti-aircraft battery. He was a corporal. Because of all that wonderful military experience he had at Pier Indian School, where they marched every day and stood in formation for 4 hours on Sunday for God knows what reason. He knew the drills. So immediately when he gets to basic, he's made a corporal. He's put into a battalion where he's the only Native American, and he said he never experienced an iota of prejudice. Had great Army buddies. That too, I think, was a part of his bridging 2 cultures. But he fought in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. And for a brief time, as is terribly important, he was part of the occupying forces in Germany. He is mustered out in 1945. He returns to Mitchell. Now that's significant. Of all the places that you could go, he didn't go back to Crow Creek, he didn't go back to Pier. There wasn't anything at Crow Creek, and he really didn't like Pier, something that many academics share an opinion about. So he returned to Mitchell because he did like Mitchell. And here I've always liked this one because the Mitchell paper got it wrong. If you will, proofreaders here will say, what brush did he paint? Okay, when he was in Germany. Truly romantic story, which I will not go into because I won't do it justice. Wait for the book. He encountered a young, beautiful 18-year-old German girl, Heidi Hampel. And that same persistence that we saw with the murals in Mitchell, in Mobridge, he brought to bear on that courtship. He wouldn't go away, and he wouldn't go away, and he'd be back every day. Pretty soon the family took him in, Pretty soon they started liking him. Pretty soon Heidi and he were in love. And so that's the beginning of a really beautiful story. As you can see, she was an incredibly beautiful woman, and still is. When he was back in Mitchell, he was freelancing. Now everybody knows that's not an easy way to make a living, and certainly the federal government was going to be kind of leery about a freelance artist bringing a German war bride over without evidence of the fact that he could support a family. So Oscar was very ingenious. He started doing commission work. Here's one that you can still see today at the Heritage Center in Pier, part of a series of 5 paintings he did on Indian games for Don Robinson, the grand old man of South Dakota history and historical society. But what really did the trick was in 1947, the second year of the most important Native American annual national painting show at the Philbrook, which had a 24-year run of being the most important show for Indian artists in America. In the second year, this painting won the grand prize. $350. Okay, you think, wow, that's not much money. A few years before that, Grant Wood sold his painting in a similar exhibition, American Gothic, the Chicago Art Institute, for $300. So that was a going price, you see. And so $350 was sufficient, along with Don Robinson's good letter to the federal government saying this is a good, reputable man who can support a family. Oscar sent for Heidi. More neat stories. Anyhow, he marries Heidi, and they go to Mitchell, but very quickly they go to Oklahoma, spend 9 months working at the University of Oklahoma, the basis of what? The Kiowa Five, with the very same instructor who had brought those people together, Oscar B. Jacobson, the head of the program there. Okay, Engadon is born there, and then they return to South Dakota, a family of 3, 1948 to 1952. On the GI Bill, he attends Dakota Wesleyan University in Mitchell. This is what the work looks like in that volume of North American Indian costumes that Jacobson authored. This is the Dakota Wesleyan that they walked into. They lived in a trailer camp, as most GIs did. Excuse me, I'm going to get to my notes. I've been ignoring them. I don't know why I do that. I spent a lot of time on this. I'm going, damn it, I'm going to, there we go. All right. The president of DWU, knowing Oscar from before, wanted him to be the artist in residence there and wanted him to be a student. Okay, so Dr. Hilburn kind of coerced him, brought him back. And since the enrollment at DWU, because of the GI Bill in 1947, tripled. Think about what a problem that causes for any of you. I mean, it would be a problem you'd like to have, but where would you house those people? So they got a bunch of, not FEMA trailers, but, next best thing, trailers that were decommissioned from the war plants, et cetera, and the bases, et cetera. And they started here at the University Park, which sounds very nice. DWU was a little more honest about what these things were like. They called it Trailer Town. And those trailers were spacious, 7.5 feet by 22 feet. No bathroom, a common bathing facility. And they were off and running. This is the Howe family. I always have loved this. Oscar bartered a painting to a local photographer for this. Oscar became, in 1948, the decorator of the Corn Palace. Now, anybody who knows Mitchell knows that the Corn Palace is the heart of Mitchell's identity. Maybe today they're not quite as aggressive about promoting that, but it has always been the center, the heart, the icon, something that made them special. John Philip Sousa played there, etc. People would come from trains from all over to go to the Corn Palace. Tourists still come. It really was the heart. Oscar, for 10 years before this, since he first came back to South Dakota from Santa Fe, wanted to be the Corn Palace artist. In 1948, after he made some special efforts, he was made the Corn Palace artist and was a Corn Palace artist for 20-some years following that. I would say that Corn Palace job made Oscar even more of an important person in Mitchell. Mitchell, for the Howe family, was a wonderful place, encountering little, if any, prejudice, and basically really being parts of the community. Now, that was aided and abetted by the fact that DWU was swollen by all of these new people coming back, and new faculty like George McGovern, himself a GI Bill recipient, who was on the faculty there, Robert Pennington, a major scholar who later wrote a book on Oscar Howe. I personally have always marveled that Howe wanted to do these murals. Working in corn is not something that would endear itself to me. I don't care how many pretty colors of corn you can grow. But maybe he was still being haunted by the first vision he had of the Mobridge Auditorium with those 16 by 20 panels. Maybe this didn't daunt him to be working on 75-foot panels. But he did what is truly the most remarkable work, using half of corn cobs and grasses, etc. And this is just one example. He took great pride in that. In 1952, and this is another measure of the man. He could have stayed on at DWU and had a nice faculty job. No. Took the GI Bill, went back to the University of Oklahoma, where you'll recall he had an entree with Jacobson, and applies to the Master of Fine Arts program. Well, by that time, Jacobson's no longer the chair of the department. A whole bunch of 30-something smartasses have taken over. All of the modernist, New York-based styles, they take a look at Howe's work and they say, you're really good at what you do. We can't teach you a thing. We're not going to let you into the program because we don't, unless you want to change. And Howe stopped him right there and said, I intend to change. And so he did, and on his own terms. And in 1953, he completes his program, receives his degree in 1954. 1953 to 1957, he is the director of the art program at Pierre High School this time. Another interesting adventure. One of his students at the Pierre High School goes on to be the most eminent of the Native American artists of the next generation, the generation of the 60s, and that's Fritz Scholder. And Fritz Scholder has said some very important things about Oscar Howe. This is what Howe is painting like. Okay, before he goes, this is a wonderful example of Howe's work from the early 50s, before going to the University of Oklahoma and seeking that change. You can see why those teachers would say, you're already a master. Go paint in the studio style. You're already winning all the prizes. Go away. This is what Howe did as one of the pieces in his MFA thesis a year later. Now, Howe was part of a small group of people who recognized Indian art had stalled, that the Kiowa 5 and the Santa Fe studio style had become stereotypical and cliched and was being driven by a white marketplace, people telling Indians what Indian art should be. He wanted more self-expression. He became a vocal person for self-expression, something that he had instinctively, something that Dorothy Dunn's training obviously instilled in most of those young artists, at least in the 5 years that she was there. Okay, now, brace yourself. The issue, and it's a critical one, is what scholars have done with Howe's transition. The issue of Cubism. This, of course, is our old friend Pablo Picasso, who I also knew personally. I mean, if I know Oscar Howe and Michelangelo, Pablo and I used to drink together. All right. The issue of Cubism. Scholars are remarkably industrious, but not largely creative people. They have a gestalt that they like to place people, and once that placement is done, they move on. And so somebody got the great idea that Oscar Howe was a cubist. Look at this, and look at this. Similar colors, similar angles. The fact that the space is doing something entirely different really doesn't make much difference. Okay, so that has been picked up and followed on and followed on and followed on. Oscar himself really got angry. I've seen him face down more than one scholar who has done that, who we brought to campus. And Oscar said, I want 15 minutes with him alone. So Oscar constantly went back to proving that there were sources in Indian traditional art that would lead him to the same conclusion. Now, one of the funny things that the people who advanced this argument that he's a Cubist and influenced was he was well-educated. Okay, well, of course, that meant he encountered Cubism. Yeah. Okay. The one I like best is, well, you know, he traveled in Europe. I'm sure that a lot of those museums had a, infantry day where the soldiers were let in for nothing. They were all closed down. He didn't see any art in Germany or in France. And when he came back, he was in his studies himself. I mean, literally, the people, the chair of his department said, he got a studio. We didn't see him. He came back, gave us his theses. Okay. So, I do, however, believe there is some wisdom in linking Howe to American modernism. And I think this is where we find our niche for what Oscar Howe always believed and always wanted, and that is being part of the mainstream as an American artist who happened to be Indian, who drew on his Indian roots because those were his roots, like Picasso drew on his Spanish roots in his French experiences. Okay, so where I find Oscar Howe gaining confidence, experience, or a point of reference is in what American artists in the 30s did with their modernism. People like Stuart Davis. Howe read, Howe looked, Howe traveled, Howe was a member of the 20th century. Howe was incorporating the best of both worlds, the traditional and the modern. Then he'd have to do it in his art. If he did it in his life, if he did it in his talk, if he did it in his life, he was going to do it in his art. And it is this where I find a similarity. He saw this, and he saw the similarities. And he had an Indian modernist ideal well before many other people. It was 1955, as the provost told you, that we started a new initiative here at the university with the assistance of the legislature, and that was the Institute of Indian Studies. They needed Indian faculty. Dean Harrington went and recruited Oscar Howe, brought him in here, made a position for him by borrowing one, stealing one, cajoling one out of the history department, made him a faculty member in fine arts, but in a very special setting. He also was artist in residence, and he was an assistant director of the WHO Museum, and he was housed off campus, downtown, along with Wayne Knutson, in a storefront, second floor, called something like the Creative Arts Laboratory. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Where he had a studio as well. In 1958, Howe did a painting that he was sending then to the Philbrook exhibition. You know, remember the Philbrook was that national show for many years. Howe was a juror there. He won that first prize that brought Heidi here. He won prizes year after year after year. And in 1958, he sent this very painting, a War and Peace figure, to the exhibition, and the jurors did not give it a prize. Many times you'll read it didn't get in. It got in, but it didn't get a prize. Howe thought, this is my best work. This is cutting-edge stuff. So he writes a letter, and I want you to see that letter, because it is a manifesto, and it changed Native American art. By the way, this painting has gone missing. It's somewhere out there in the world, so you memorize it, and if you see it on your maiden Aunt Millie's wall, you call me. I'll bring money, and maiden Aunt Millie can retire. Okay, so he writes to somebody who's a registrar and a curator at the Philbrook, Jeannie Snodgrass, who later became a great friend of mine, and we spent lots of time talking about this event. Dear Miss Snodgrass, whoever said that my paintings are not in the traditional Indian style has poor knowledge of Indian art indeed. There is much more to Indian art than pretty, stylized pictures. There was also power and strength and individualism emotional and intellectual insight in the old Indian paintings? Are we to be held back forever with one phase of Indian painting with no right for individualism, dedicated as the Indian always has been, put on reservations and treated like a child, and only the white man knows what is best for him? Now, even in art, you little child, do what we think is best for you, nothing different. Well, I'm not going to stand for it. Indian art can compete with any art in the world, but not as a suppressed art. I see so much of the mismanagement and mistreatment of my people, it makes me cry inside to look at these poor people. My father died there about 3 years ago in a little shack. My two brothers still living there in shacks, never enough to eat, never enough clothing, treated as second-class citizens. This is one of the reasons I have tried to keep the fine ways and culture of my forebears alive. But one could easily turn to becoming a social protest painter. I only hope the art world will not be one more contributor to holding us in chains. Powerful. So powerful that it humbled the establishment. They changed the rules, introduced a experimental Indian art category the next year, and the floodgates opened. It was out there waiting. There were artists working in it. It was an invitation, and they flooded in. There, many artists of today tells me, is the manifesto. There's a statement that freed up Indian artists to be individuals. Well, the honors kept coming. Harvey Dunn Medal, Dorothy Field, the Denver Museum Medal, South Dakota Artist Laureate. Today, even though he's deceased for many years, he's still South Dakota's Artist Laureate. The Wade Phillips, which you see here, is the highest honor that's ever been given to Native American artists, and I don't believe it's still given. Oscar received it in 1966 as a Lifetime Achievement Award for outstanding contributions to American Indian art, along with a handful of others over a 6-year period that I can track. He was South Dakota's first recipient of the Governor's Award for Distinguished Achievement. And this won't mean anything to most of you. If you're not my age, you don't remember. But he was on the most prominent television show. Granted, there were only 2 or 3 channels, but this one dominated. Ralph Edwards' This Is Your Life. And it's a wonderful tape to watch. I have a copy of that tape, of that program, which they made me show only in a locked room and only to people that are working on a Howe scholarship. But it is wonderful. His old teachers and old friends are all there. It is a wonderful piece of history. Ralph Edwards bought this painting, and it's interesting because you just heard how Oscar said you could turn to be a social protest painter. Here he has. And this was a complex man. He knew racism. He understood racism personally and collectively for his people. He resented racism. He just didn't let it get him caught between 2 cultures belonging to neither. So he painted this and a few others that dealt with the single most emblematic event for the Dakota people, the Sioux of South Dakota. That is the massacre at Wounded Knee. This painting was then given by Edwards to the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, where it still is. When we mounted that retrospective in 1980, they refused to lend it because it was still too provocative. You live with this painting for a while and you will actually see things that bring this to life in front of you. The same way you do when you look at Goya's massacre, May 5th, May 3rd, whatever it is. Okay. It has that same power to evoke man's inhumanity to man, the suffering of real people at the hand of androids. So this is a powerful painting, but this is much more what we think of when we experience Oscar Howe. Masterfully done. drive from native spirituality, the calling on Wankantanka, which is in our collection and is one of my favorite of all his paintings. But Howe's lesson did not stop there. Oscar Howe was a dedicated and a great teacher, not of art appreciation. The university did a tremendous disservice to this man in putting him into adventure in the arts and art appreciation. But he dutifully did it. And I still have students of his from that time say, I was in that class, I wish I'd paid attention. You know, some of them did, but where his real teaching took place was one-on-one, as any good studio artist best teaching does. And he taught students whom he dearly loved. He loved his high school students in Pierre, South Dakota. He loved his college students. And he had a vision. His vision was based on what he saw in Oklahoma and in Santa Fe, where Indian art was a major business, where there were museums for Indian art, where there were dealers in Indian art, where Indian artists were making a decent living, to do the same thing in the Northern Plains. South Dakota was to have a similar school of high-quality Northern Plains Indian fine arts. And he'd go to the reservation, and he'd talk to the kids. He started the Oscar Howe Institute, and he, for 10 years, brought in promising young people on scholarship, as we still do today. And from that came major artists to the next generation. But no, he did not achieve his vision. He did not establish a Northern Plains school. That is a mission left to us. It is a mission the university must accept and that the state must support. And we will, I'm convinced, as we go through these transitions. Here he is, working with 3 people, 2 of whom I know. Don Montelo, who is a major artist in his early 40s now, professional artist, Rapid City, is the young 16-year-old sitting there closest to you. Other artists that worked with him included obviously Bobby Penn, but Bobby Penn's a special case because he was not only an institute person, but he was a student of Oscar's for 4 years here, and really Oscar's protege, and we really viewed Oscar as his father, our father's substitute. So it is interesting that Bobby Penn's son, Quanah Penn, came to the Institute, Oscar Howe Institute, as well. Graduated from here with a BFA in art, an MFA from the University of Colorado, an MA in art history from the University of Chicago, and will eventually get a PhD in art history from Berkeley. That's the kind of person-by-person success that we have to keep at. Oscar died in 1953. His health began failing early, had a heart attack in '74, onset of Parkinson's. Never, no matter how ill he was, did the spark die. He drew even shakily. We in the art department worked with him on 2 special projects that were lithographs, which we made and our technicians printed and our artists work on. He was unwilling to give up. Even when he couldn't draw anymore, he was working on his invention of a perpetual motion machine. And he would talk to you about it. He believed he could do that. I'm not so sure he couldn't. He is buried out here at Cliffview Cemetery, and on his ledger stone, bearing the Tohokma sign, a quote that Mrs. Howe chose that was important to Oscar. In art, I have realized a part of a dream, to present a true image of the Dakota Indian as I understood him and his culture. Now this is a story, this is the image I was telling you about that I want to comment on as it being typical of so many stories of paintings that have come to me from people who collected them over the years, either to authenticate them or to appraise them, much to poor Oscar's frustration, I am sure. He must roll over in his grave whenever this statement is made. But it appears that I am the expert on Oscar Howe. And so everything comes to me. They'll call down to University of Oklahoma and say, we've got this Oscar Howe. They'll say, call John Day. The person in Montana says, I've got an Oscar Howe, I want to donate. They says, there's a guy at the University of South Dakota you need to talk to. And that's been repeated over the years, so that I have built up a great deal of stories about the genealogy of these paintings. Some of them are tremendously moving. This one that I particularly like at this point just came to our collection as a gift from a truly remarkable woman by the name, the improbable name, of Brookie Calhoun Zazac, who lives in Tucson. The story she tells, and she's had this for many, many years, the story she tells about it is, I think, very important. Her father, Herbert Calhoun, was the head of the Pure Indian School, the superintendent of the Pure Indian School in 1938. 1938, Oscar Howe graduates from Santa Fe and is coming home to Crow Creek. Gets as far as Pure, has no more money. Goes to Pure Indian School, sees this man, sells him this painting for $25. The man drives him home. And, and Oscar has $25 to start his life there in Crow Creek again, brief though his stay there was. This has been a beloved object of that family ever since. Now at 80, she wants to place it someplace where it will make a difference. This week I received 4 more Oscar Howe paintings from somebody in Montana who wanted to send them home to South Dakota, to this university, for you and others to profit from. So, now in conclusion, aren't you glad there is a conclusion? Howe and his generation lived when Indian art was segregated from the mainstream, with its own museums, its own dealers, its own magazines, all of that. It was seen as and characterized as a minor art, a second-rate art, certainly not anything worthy of the Museum of Modern Art. Howe in particular resented that, considering it racist, because he considered himself to be a great American artist. And who better to be an American artist than a Native American? Postmodernism has moved on. The mainstream is gone. Indian art has moved into the mainstream, has every other stream of art you can think of. Outsider art, any kind of art that you want to think about is now being savored and interpreted and brought into the multifaceted mainstream, which is much like the melting pot, vastly changed from tomato soup to a real good stew. So that it has changed. However, despite that mainstreaming, which has served Fritz Scholder and Jean Quick-to-See Smith and this generation of artists so well, art history and the art world is dynamic, driven by commerce and scholarship needs. And so, really great, important artists become historical footnotes with simplistic characterizations like Cubist. You'll be happy to know that I resisted the impulse here to add one last slide entitled, How Now? But the issue of Howe's status in the art world is important. He is still referenced in all the serious texts as a major force in the development of American Indian fine arts. The text that I use in the Native American art history class has several pages on Howe, and they cope with that Cubist issue as intelligent scholars would, not as an easy label, but by saying, as I say, that Howe was a modernist. Not going as far as I would go with it, but they do. Other people looking for quick identifiers and labels say Howe, the American Indian Cubist. However, scholars still research him using our resources. Bill Anthus just published a book called Native Moderns, American Indian Painting, 1940 to 1960, printed by Duke University Press, soon to be released sometime in October. Bill came here, researched, we became friends. He argues for recognizing the transformative work of a small group of artists, including Oscar Howe, as distinctly modern, and explains how bringing Native American modernism into the foreground rewrites the broader canon of American modernism. And I'm happy to say Bill Anthus will be next year's Oscar Howe lecturer. Thank you.